Hello, everyone. This is the disembodied voice of Dr. Sam Hurst. And this is the fifth in our series of the October Gothics a Day, Tempts the Vampires to Stay. I'm just a disembodied voice today because, as you might be able to hear, I'm a little bit unwell and nobody needs to see that. So I've put together a little slideshow instead with some pictures from an adaptation of the novel, which I'm going to be talking about. Now, the title of today's session is A Love Note with Bite, which might give you some ideas, possibly erroneous ones. We're not talking about vampires today, but rather we're talking about parody. But I'm wanting to suggest with this idea of the love note with bite that this is a parody which isn't simply mocking, but is also very affectionately looking at the books which it's taking up. I'm also going to be taking us for the first time into the 19th century with a book published in 1817. If you can't already guess what I'm talking about, let me make it clear. I'm talking about Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which was originally written for publication in 1803, but was never published by the publisher who took it on. It was sold back to her brother, who then published it posthumously after her death with the title Northanger Abbey. There's some suggestion that she changed it in the years 1816 to 1817 a little bit. And certainly her working title was Catherine, but the ultimate published version, Northanger Abbey, had a changed title, which was the suggestion of her brother. Now, when it was originally set out for publication in 1803, we're seeing it written really in the heyday, or the last years of that heyday period of the Gothic, before the Gothic's decline into the 19th century. And so we're seeing a parody that was very fresh, interacting with a very popular genre. It's also a parody which, as I've mentioned, was affectionate. It certainly turns a laughing eye to the excesses of the Gothic, but it also points to the underlying truths of the Gothic. For example, we find Catherine, when she meets the father of the man that she comes to love, Henry Tilney, she meets General Tilney, she views him through a Gothic lens. She's been reading too many Gothic novels, and she interprets the situation with a great deal of excess, viewing him as a murderer and akin to Montoni, the villain from The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Of course, she's wrong, but she's not completely wrong. What her Gothic lens has done is not simply help her to misread the truth, it's also helped her to see it, because she, unlike many of those around her, has been able to see to the core of a man who is a spousal abuser, a tyrannous father, an incredibly cruel and mercenary. At one point, of course, he throws Catherine out into the night, which was very unacceptable behavior, particularly at the time when dealing with a young woman. So this is a parody, which we're going to see going back and forth, talking about the Gothic in different ways, but never simply condemning it. One of the reasons that it's so important is because it shows us some of the attitudes to the Gothic that were extant at the time. Some of the recognitions of its repetitive formulas, of course, but also the recognition of readers like Jane Austen that what the Gothic is often really dealing with is the position of women in society and their oppression, using an excessive framework in the Gothic more normally, but still pointing towards these underlying truths, which Jane Austen provides us with in a much more realistic contemporary setting. It's also important for critics, or was particularly towards the start of the 20th century, because Northanger Abbey includes a list of horrid novels, which Catherine's then friend Isabella recommends to her. The list is The Castle of Wolfenbach and the Mysterious Warning, both by Eliza Parsons, The Necromancer or A Tale of the Black Forest by Carl Frederick Callett, Horrid Mysteries by the Marquis de Gauss, The Midnight Bell by Francis Latham, Clement by Regina Marie Roche, and The Orphan of the Rhine by Eleanor Sleaf, also mentioned The Italian and the Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Now, for a long time, these were considered to be non-existent or made-up titles, but at the beginning of the 20th century, many of these titles were discovered to be real. So we find Northanger Abbey also is a sort of critical text in excavating that Gothic past, and particularly those books which perhaps weren't as well known or as popular or had a more fleeting popularity. Now, what is the story? Well, it's all about young Catherine Morland, who is a lover of Gothic novels. The story starts for her really when she gets to go to Bath with a family friend. And that's when her adventures begin, and also her misreadings through her Gothic lens. Catapulted into the big wide world, she starts to understand everything through the frameworks of the romances she's been reading, including, as I've already mentioned, the story of the family of the man that she loves, pictured here, Henry Tilney. The ITV version, which that clip was from, used this conception of this Gothic framework and the way in which she uses her reading to read her world by including these little vignettes, which you can trace back to specific Gothic novels. It was a good shorthand for what the novel generally is doing. In Bath, she meets the Thorpes, and here we see her with Isabella Thorpe, her friend, or so she thinks. And this is the brother John. Now, Catherine and Isabella have an instant friendship forged over Gothic texts. And this kind of motif of using Gothic texts to start friendships or to interrogate character continues with the brother John, who dismisses the Gothic. And the fact that he refuses to read the Mysteries of Udolpho and discounts it, preferring the gory and sexualized excesses of the monk, is a sure hint of his terrible character. In Bath, Catherine also meets Henry Tilney, the man she will come to love, and his love of the Mysteries of Udolpho and ability to appreciate both serious literature and novels is a sign of his excellent character. So again, just to reiterate, what we're not seeing in this book is a very cruel parody of the Gothic, but more of a love note to it. Now, Catherine meets Henry and his sister Eleanor and is eventually invited to his house, Northanger Abbey. There she gets on quite well, but because of a misunderstanding, she ends up being kicked out of the house. This is also after she's built up a whole Gothic story around General Tilney, the father of Henry Tilney. And as we see here from this illustration, we have this quote, "It was the air and attitude of a Montoni." And by comparing him to Montoni, she's comparing him to a murderer and a brigand. Now, he ends up throwing her out of the house for various different reasons, which you'll have to read the book to find out about. And she ends up going home. But the story ends well because ultimately Henry Tilney disavows his father or his father's wishes and departs to find Catherine. And ultimately, there they are, falling very much in love. It's a fun read for those of us already aware of the Gothic, but it's also a great introduction to the Gothic and a good starting point. It's how I started reading many Gothic novels. I found them named in here and I went out and looked for them. If you enjoy it, I would recommend reading Austen's other works, particularly her later work, Persuasion. I'd also recommend that you have a look at some other Gothic parodies of the period. One that leaps to mind is Thomas Love Peacock's Nightmare Abbey, although that is a much more sort of cruel and witty parody or satire upon the Gothic and upon the Romantic movements and philosophical movements of the period. If you're interested in other Gothic texts, which Northanger Abbey is borrowing from, then the list of horrid novels that I've already mentioned is a good starting place. So I hope you enjoy your Gothic adventures and thank you for listening.